You know it as marijuana, Indian hemp, ganja or cannabis. To you, it's an artificial and illicit pleasure, a drug. And that's true. The proof is it makes you high. But cannabis has a whole other side to it that is just as stupefying. We're about to go on a journey, an investigation to discover the medical potential of a plant that perhaps was demonized too soon. Along with California, Colorado is one of the first states to have authorized the medical use of cannabis in the US. This was in 2001. Here there are a lot of specialized pharmacies, all displaying the famous 5-branch leaf.
How's it going?
Hi, how are you?
Doing pretty well.
Good, good. I'm just coming in to pick up some Mary's patches today.
All right, you guys have your medical card on you? All right. While we do the transaction.
Sure.
All right, looks like we're all good.
Okay.
Come on back, guys. There we go.
The clientele doesn't coincide with the image you probably have of regular drug users.
Okay.
Megan comes here to buy medicine to treat her daughter.
Gonna go with the CBD THC patch.
Addie suffers from severe epilepsy that resisted every classical treatment.
Do you want me to talk about it or just...
Her seizures, up to several hundred per day, prevented her from growing up normally and would probably have killed her.
They have the CBN capsules.
Got to the point where we were considering cannabis for our child. Again, she was sleeping 22 hours a day. Our pediatrician was preparing us for her to die. We were receiving palliative care through Mass General Hospital for children. So at that point, we thought she was going to die. So I'm not sure what would happen had we not been able to get access to cannabis. We know clearly that this has significantly changed her quality of life. Whether it has also extended her life, time will tell. But we're very, very fortunate that this was an option for us.
3 years later, Addie has some mental retardation, but the seizures have almost disappeared. She can play with her brother, and above all, this year she can go to school.
So when we started her on cannabis, we gave her a very, very small dose of a high CBD oil, and within 5 minutes of that first dose, she smiled. And she hadn't smiled in probably 3 or 4 months prior to that because she was so medicated from the other drugs. We did not see seizure control for another couple of months, but over time it did get better and better, and now her quality of life is heads and shoulders above where it was.
Twice a day, Addie's treatment consists of swallowing a few drops of an oil prepared from cannabis flowers.
Hi. We're gonna do some
But of
oil,
course,
ready?
these drops have no euphoric or psychotropic effects.
Good girl. Good girl, there. All done. All done. Good girl. Ready? Let's go for a walk. Come on,
The
baby.
doctors prescribed a special variety of cannabis for children that is grown in Colorado greenhouses. Today, thousands of patients, whatever their age, are treated with cannabis. And there are so many ways to consume it that, to keep informed, patients' families have founded an association. Realm of Caring, a major caregiver, is known throughout the country.
Thank you for calling the Realm of Caring Foundation. This is Lynette. How can I help you?
If we're talking about schizophrenia, Charlotte's Web, yes ma'am, you could see results, but what you need to be aware of is that it has a little bit of THC. So with time, you might get a negative reaction.
So this right here is the Realm of Caring Care Team. It consists of 7 individuals who speak 4 different languages, and what we do is about 7,000 interactions a month. We make sure that these individuals, our care team, are absolutely up to date and current on any research, science, data that's available for medical cannabis.
If you can get it as close to the source of the cancer, that's always best.
We do promote medical cannabis. We have a lot of believers here in medical cannabis. Scientifically and research-wise, it's really starting to pick up, and there's a lot of information out there now, and we hope to be able to provide that information in a concise manner.
The keen interest in the medical use of cannabis is not restricted to Colorado. Even though it remains illegal on the federal level, in 2016 more than half of the states in the US had already legalized its medical use. Dozens of countries worldwide have done the same, such as Canada, Israel or Germany, which has recently changed its legislation. But some countries refuse, like Poland, Greece and especially France. Here, no re-evaluation for cannabis, not even medical. According to the French National Academy of Medicine, this plant and its contents have no place in pharmacies.
For a long time, our Academy of Medicine has considered the problem of cannabis in general and of its therapeutic values in particular. After assembling and analysing all the information derived from the numerous reports and the results of various trials, we've reached one simple conclusion. Cannabis is a real drug, but not a real medicine. Over a length of time, its use leads to addiction, to dependence, the need to have it on a regular basis. The result is cognitive disruption, learning disruption, and memory disruption.
To better understand the consequences of using cannabis, a study was done by analysing the brain scans of heavy smokers. And the results obtained by Professor Jean-Luc Martineau confirm that regular use of cannabis impacts the brain.
So in the brain of a person who has regularly used cannabis, that is, on a daily basis, we can observe modifications in the structure of the brain, but above all in its functioning. For example, we've seen that there is a 20% decrease of a substance that regulates the transmission between the neurons.
These modifications in the brain could explain memory loss, problems with concentration, and impulsive behavior observed in adults who are heavy smokers. But the main worry of scientists and doctors concerns the consumption of cannabis during adolescence.
In adolescence, the brain is in a major stage of development and is maturing rapidly. Also developing is the quality of the white material, which are fibers that link the different parts of the brain together. So there is a very big risk to brain development, although we still don't know what the consequences may be.
Certain doctors are worried about the consequences of using a drug, even for medical purposes. But for Professor Amin Baryaminar, who participated in these impact studies, the two aspects of its use must remain separate.
Obviously, cannabis use for adolescents poses certain risks. It could cause problems linked with learning, cognition, and concentration, and also a risk, small but real, of serious illnesses like schizophrenia. We're not referring to medical cannabis here, but about cannabis sold on the street, whose provenance and contents remains unknown. Like all the products, all molecules put on the market, medical cannabis undergoes rigorous testing before being released to the public. These are two different things and they should not be confused.
The use of medical cannabis is hardly a new idea. Different traditional medicines recognized its virtues a very long time ago.
The medical use of cannabis in traditional Chinese medicine goes back to about the 1st century AD. And we have written fragments with drawings of this plant describing its somatic and psychic powers.
In the past, cannabis was usually chewed or taken as a tea. It was often smoked, but not always for its therapeutic effects. In antiquity, cannabis was mentioned in the pharmacopoeias of India, the Middle East, and even Greece.
Queen Victoria's doctor prescribed cannabis to relieve the suffering and pain of her legendary painful menstruation.
But with the arrival of aspirin, which was more effective and easier to produce, cannabis could no longer compete. Old-fashioned in the eyes of doctors, it became obsolete. The final blow came in the US in the 30s. When Prohibition ended, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics started a war against drugs. Cannabis, heroin, and cocaine were all put in the same category.
The Treasury Department intends to pursue a relentless warfare against the despicable, dope-peddling vulture who preys on the weakness of his fellow man.
Cannabis made the headlines almost every day. Sex scandals, crimes of passion, it was blamed for everything. Propaganda films produced by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics were distributed in movie theaters. In them, cannabis is responsible for perverting the young and driving them to lust, crime, and suicide. Within a few years, cannabis became public enemy number one. It was banned from the pharmacopoeia. In 1961, it joined opium and coca on the UN list of the most dangerous drugs. Without any study scientifically proving its danger, cannabis was prohibited throughout the world. But in 1964, a new study of cannabis was undertaken. It was in Israel that renewed interest in medical cannabis began, and again, thanks to a young biochemist. Raphael Meshulam, 30 years old at the time. For him, it was an ideal research subject. The plant turned on the entire youth culture without anyone knowing how or why. Finding out its secret, its principal active ingredient, became his obsession.
This is a chromatography column, and this is the method we used almost 50 years ago to separate the constituents. And at that time, we found that there are two major constituents that we could separate. THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, all the compound that we found, our colleagues found that they work on monkeys. They have a psychoactivity in the monkey. And the second compound was cannabidiol, which had no activity in the monkey.
For the first time, the principal active substance in cannabis was identified, isolated in a test tube, tetrahydrocannabinol. And the first experiment on humans remains legendary in the annals of research.
The next step was we decided to test the material we had on us, my family and my friends. So we did an experiment at home. My wife made a big cake with 10 milligrams of THC. So by using 10 milligrams, we had different effects. My wife was kind of sitting in a chair and dreaming. Another one said, I don't feel anything, but he would laugh every 15 seconds. Start laughing, ha, 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 stop. Another 15 seconds, ha, 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 and laugh. Different completely. We had one case, unpleasant. She came afraid. 4 or 5 people with a relatively pleasant reaction. One person with an anxiety reaction, which is seen today very often.
THC, cannabidiol, CBN, CBG. No less than 144 new molecules have, since then, been identified in this plant. We call them the cannabinoids. They accumulate in the tiny crystals that cover the flower and the buds, the trichomes. In nature, cannabis is the only plant that knows how to produce these cannabinoids.
So, can you tell the difference between all these odors?
Yes, there are many. Here, the active ingredient is more THC.
From the beginning, Raphael Mechoulam had a hypothesis to explain the psychotropic effect. The THC had to have special access to our neurons. His intuition was confirmed in 1988.
After the chemistry and the biology of the plant materials were known, we had to go into the mechanism. And the mechanism, the original step, was done by an American, Alan Howlett, and she found that there is a receptor. And the receptor is activated by THC. So here we have a new mechanism, completely new mechanism.
In other words, just as a key slides into a lock, the THC binds itself onto this receptor situated on the surface of the brain cells. The key turns in the lock and sets off a cascade of reactions that take control of neuronal activity. But this discovery raised a disturbing question. Why does our brain have receptors that are sensitive to cannabis? Are we naturally predisposed to artificial bliss?
Now, receptors don't exist in our brain because there is a plant. A receptor exists because we make compounds that activate this receptor when and where needed.
It was Lumir Hanus, his research partner, who identified this compound, anandamide. This is the original key, produced by our own bodies. It opens the same lock as THC does. In fact, THC only mimics the natural action of anandamide.
Discovery of anandamide was for us exciting process, and as soon as we had this compound in our hands, so we named it anandamide. Ananda, it's Sanskrit bliss, delight, and amide because it's arachidonyl ethanol amide. We expected that this compound makes a person happy, that is inner bliss. We were right, and at the same time, bliss, delight, it was happiness of discoverers.
Raphael Mechoulam and his team discovered why cannabis produces psychotropic effects. By inundating our brain with THC, it overstimulates a natural system which is in charge of our well-being, the endocannabinoid system, in which anandamide and its receptor are the basic elements. Anandamide and its receptors are found mainly in our brains. But a number of different keys and locks have been identified in the rest of our body, a kind of rebalancing and general calming mechanism. The endocannabinoid system is everywhere and intervenes in the regulation of sleep, digestion, inflammatory reactions, and on the nervous system. In Israel, the scientific argument has already convinced many people. Cannabis has become the flagship product for a new branch of medicine. Fences, barbed wire, guards, and video surveillance. The production of medical cannabis is legal, but still under tight control. Tikkun Olam is one of the 8 companies authorized by the Minister of Health to grow, prescribe, and sell medical cannabis. To justify its medical use, the cannabis industry has hired botanists, agronomists, horticulturalists, and even geneticists. Their clients are mostly patients, and they are working to furnish products that are reliable, safe, and homogeneous, like any other medication.
At Tikkun Olam, we grow more than 20 different strains of cannabis. For example, this one contains more than 15% of THC. Some strains, such as Avedekel or Raphael, are enriched with CBD. Midnight is a strain containing 15% of both THC and CBD.
Each strain has a specific composition with particular properties. They are being evaluated in dozens of clinical trials presently being held in Israeli hospitals. Although they are already available in specialized pharmacies, none of these plants yet qualify as standard medication. The scientists at Tikkun Olam are convinced that, to effectively treat an illness, a plant must be developed that contains the molecular combination which works best upon the patient's endocannabinoid system. This complex process takes place in the genetic and biochemical analysis laboratory attached to the greenhouses.
Every year, we analyze the DNA of each plant one by one. We then compare that genetic information to a patient's particular clinical profile. We can thus work towards improving the plant's genetic profile, towards obtaining the specific properties that will have the best results. At present, we are especially studying CBG, a cannabinoid which is less familiar than THC or CBD. Our objective is to produce a new strain of cannabis that produces a high content of this cannabinoid. We think it could be very effective in certain clinical cases.
The first tests indicate that the CBG would be particularly effective against stress and certain skin inflammations. More than 8,000 patients across the country who suffer from different illnesses such as colitis, Parkinson's or rheumatoid polyarthritis depend on the cannabis produced by Tikkun Olam. Dozens of tons of this cannabis leave the greenhouses in the form of pills or oils, but also, and perhaps what is most surprising, as ready-to-smoke joints. To guarantee traceability, the government requires producers to provide information every step of the way, from seed to sale. With 3 harvests per year, the site supplies all the pharmacies of Tikkun Olam, such as this one south of Tel Aviv. Access is strictly regulated. Only with a certified doctor's prescription is anyone allowed to enter and make a purchase. Hannah suffers from Crohn's disease, a chronic intestinal inflammation. 2 years ago, she participated in the very first clinical trials evaluating the effect of cannabis on her pathology. Since then, she continues to be monitored by a doctor. But today, for the final evaluation of her treatment, she consults the doctor who originally enrolled her in the clinical study.
Come on in. Hello. Hello. So, how are you feeling? Pretty good. I want to show you these medications I brought. This one and this one. Always in oil form? Yes, 2 different ones. This in the morning and the other at night. Okay, 3% CBD and this one at night. And how do they make you feel? Much better. The stomach pains have almost completely disappeared, but I'm also careful about what I eat. Before, even if I didn't eat a thing, my belly was always bloated.
I think that cannabis does have some real anti-inflammatory effect, but we have to learn how to use it. There's a lot of information which is lacking.
Here's your prescription. Thank you, doctor. Take care of yourself. Bye. Have a nice day.
One of the problems is when you try and give cannabis to patients, you do get all these people who actually are not patients and are not sick, and they think to themselves, oh, here's an easy way of getting good quality cannabis, and then they come and try and persuade you that they do need to get cannabis. The people like Anna, whom we saw before, who actually is not looking for the effect of feeling high or euphoria. She is looking for having less pain and less diarrhea, but she actually uses the cannabis that keeps her alert and functioning during the day.
Today in Israel, 25,000 patients daily consume cannabis as a medication, most often for lack of any other effective treatment for their pathology. Din has ocular pain that is resistant to analgesics. He was sent to the Tikkun Olam dispensary by his doctor with a prescription for cannabis therapy.
I have chronic pains that come from an inflammation behind my right eye. In addition, I'm also seeing double. They did a biopsy to rule out cancer, but it's only an inflammation. I tried all kinds of painkillers, but nothing worked. So they prescribed cannabis.
Do you have any fears related to your cannabis treatment?
No, I'm quite optimistic, and I really hope it's going to help.
I'll show you how to do it. The first time, you only take 2 puffs. No more than that. You take the cigarette, you burn off the excess paper, put it in your mouth, and inhale gently. When you finish, just put down the cigarette. It goes out by itself.
The preliminary results of clinical trials, the patients' positive reactions, and the approval of their doctors all weigh in favor of the virtues of cannabis as a medicinal plant. But to classify as a medicine, it lacked solid scientific proof of the effectiveness of its active ingredients, once purified and chemically isolated. Already in the US, pure cannabidiol, free of any euphoric or psychotropic effects, has just demonstrated its effectiveness in treating epileptic fits. At the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, Elizabeth Thiel is heading these trials. Tested on 250 children, nearly half of them saw their symptoms regress or completely disappear.
Even before the results of the trial, since I've had over 50 children on this medication now for 2 to 3 years, I know it can be effective. I know it doesn't work for everyone. It's not a silver bullet for epilepsy, but clearly many people will benefit from this as a medical therapy. I would anticipate that this treatment will be approved by the FDA for use in the United States, possibly this year, maybe next year, because the data from these trials is as good, if not better, than the data from the trials from many of our medications that have been approved in the past 15 years. So funny.
We still don't know how the cannabidiol works in the brain to impede these epileptic crises. But its use as a purified molecule was its only chance to qualify as a medicine.
Bend it now. Bend it hard. Hard, hard, hard. Perfect. And bend this one hard. Bend it hard. Very good. And now this one. It's really important for everyone to really understand the difference between the medication I've been using for 3 years, the Epidiolex or cannabidiol, and medical marijuana. Because I think that can be very confusing for people on what is the difference there. And so marijuana, again, complicated plant like most plants are, over 500 chemicals. Medical marijuana is an extract of the marijuana plant. It can be enriched in CBD or enhanced in CBD, but has all the chemicals. The cannabidiol that we've been using in these clinical trials is purified from marijuana. So it does not have all those chemicals. So they're two very different things. And we educate families about that. Well, what our children are taking with these trials is not medical marijuana, it's cannabidiol.
It's thanks to the same strategy of a purified molecule that Sativex, another medication composed of CBD and THC, has obtained the green light from American health authorities. France, after a certain reticence, finally classified it AMM, the authorization to be marketed as a medicine. This was a great media event in 2014.
Sativex, a cannabis-based mouth spray, was the first medication of its kind to be authorized in France. In a few weeks, it will be available in pharmacies. It will be prescribed exclusively to patients with multiple sclerosis who suffer from very painful muscle contractions.
50% of our patients feel an improvement after taking Sativex. It's easy to use as a spray, has very few side effects, and patients really feel better. And since the doses are only cannabis extracts, there are none of the psychoactive effects of pure cannabis.
Now available as a modern medication, cannabis can finally be used to treat a number of illnesses. But the therapeutic potential of these cannabinoids is even greater. According to the latest results obtained at the biology laboratory of the University of Madrid, THC and CBD also have the power to kill cancer cells in mice. This was discovered purely by chance.
Actually, what we discovered was not at all what we were looking for. We were studying the effects of cannabis on the nervous system, and we happened to be using cancerous cells. We observed that the cells were dying in the presence of cannabinoids. Only then did we begin to focus on the impact of cannabinoids on these cells.
The discovery of anti-tumor properties in cannabinoids sent the careers of these three scientists soaring, especially since healthy cells did not seem affected by THC and cannabidiol.
We discovered that in order to kill the tumor cells, the cannabinoids have to adhere to the cell's cannabinoid receptors, which are sometimes more numerous on the membranes of cancerous cells than on those of healthy cells. Thus, cannabinoids with a strong THC potency can set off a whole series of reactions within the cell. The green areas that you see here correspond to little autophagy vesicles. In other words, these are structures that are capable of digesting the cell. And we have discovered that these cannabinoids activate such a powerful autodigestive process, or autophagia, that they kill the tumor cells.
The cannabinoids thus induce the cancerous cells to digest themselves and thus destroy themselves. An extremely efficient process since, in the mice, the cerebral tumors regress.
Ever since the results of cannabis on a brain tumor known as glioma were published in Nature Medicine, many laboratories began doing research on other types of cancer: breast cancer, melanoma, pancreatic cancer, prostate cancer, and so on. The number of labs working on the anti-tumor properties of cannabinoids has increased from 1 to at least 50.
But the real question today is whether or not cannabinoids are also effective cancer treatments for humans.
Will it work on humans? We don't know yet. There are some cases published online that would confirm this, but nothing really based on scientific proof. We still lack precise data on its effect on humans. At present, we are working on it, but it's still too early to tell if it's as effective on humans.
Now you probably understand why so many people are fighting for legislation that approves the use of medical cannabis. There is great hope for the future, and certain results have already been proven scientifically. In France, although Sativex has been approved since 2014, it is still unavailable in pharmacies. The administration that authorized its marketing, the AMM, has since decided that proof of its effectiveness is insufficient to justify patient reimbursement. Since then, there has been an ongoing battle between the industry and the Department of Health for what is deemed an acceptable price.
If this medicine, since that's the term we are using, were somehow indispensable, it would already have been commercialized by now. A full 2 years after obtaining its AMM market status. Any doctor convinced of its effectiveness would immediately have pushed to make it available as soon as possible.
The commercialization of any medicine is followed by tough negotiations between health authorities and producers. But with Sativex, price may not be the only reason for blocking it.
I'm convinced that if the situation were not about a product containing cannabis, they would have come to some agreement a long time ago.
In France, this freeze involving medical cannabis prevents patients' access to treatments that could provide relief. That is why every year in Strasbourg, a conference is held on the subject of medical research devoted to cannabis. Bertrand Rambaud is one of its organizers.
The idea behind this conference is to share the latest results of research on the therapeutic use of cannabinoids at the international level, emphasizing that studies are being conducted all over the world. What is surprising about this conference is that it is held in France, which is among the countries that are most opposed to this kind of therapy.
One of the guest speakers this year is Dr. Franjo Grotenhermen. He suffers from a chronic illness that forces him to remain horizontal. He's famous in Germany as an advocate of cannabis therapy. Germany has recently changed its legislation on the medical use of cannabis.
Since April 2017, we can obtain cannabis flowers with a prescription, and also pharmaceutical-grade cannabis extract can be prescribed by all doctors. I treat a lot of patients who get pain relief through use of cannabis and who have been consuming it illegally for years. Some have even received prison sentences for doing so. Now at last these patients receive special authorization from the German Bureau of Narcotics, whereas for French patients there is no such authorization on the horizon, not a glimmer of hope. Requesting cannabis from a doctor equates with being an addict. Those patients must obtain cannabis without their doctor knowing it, because most practitioners are firmly opposed to it and even refuse to broach the subject. The situation is dramatic. We're not talking about minor illnesses like a cold, but very serious pathologies. On the one hand, there are patients who are suffering. On the other, there's a plant that can help them, but which is prohibited.
Bertrand is one of the cases to whom the law denies such help. Since he contracted AIDS 30 years ago, he hasn't found anything that eases the side effects of his tri-therapy, except cannabis. But with no legal source to turn to, he illegally prepares what he calls his personal medication.
I analyze the cannabis before using it to identify which cannabinoids are in the plant and also their potency. Then I make my extract and put it to good use. That is, not for smoking. That's about the dose I take. I take it orally and I leave it under my tongue for as long as possible, so the mucous glands can absorb it. This really soothes my symptoms. When they cut me off from cannabis 2 years ago, I lost 14 kilos in 3 months. Without my treatment, I couldn't bring myself to eat. 14 kilos in 3 months. If that had lasted like that for 6 months, I'd be dead. So this is what I chose to do. And the choice is breaking the law and staying alive, or because either I take my treatments or I abide by French law and just lie down on the couch and wait to kick the bucket. Those are the two choices that I'm left with.
We're forcing patients to consume cannabis illegally or take low-grade cannabis, not knowing either its origin or its content, thereby putting their lives in danger. That's the situation. Patients who could otherwise benefit from this type of product are left with no medical cannabis available to them anywhere.
In my opinion, prohibiting patients' access to medical cannabis is more a question of human rights than of health. We're talking about a therapeutic tool that's effective for many patients with a minimal amount of side effects and with no major threat of irreversible harm to their health. So, I think that to deny them the access to medical cannabis constitutes a violation of human rights.
Cannabis is not a panacea or a miracle plant, but recent scientific studies have demonstrated that its cannabinoids are effective on an ever-growing number of severe and disabling illnesses. But being ill doesn't always guarantee treatment. Sometimes you also need a lot of patience.